Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Susan Tate Ankeny, the author of American Flygirl, the true story of Hazel Ying Lee, who followed her dream against all the odds and became an American hero. This is her second book, and she also works for a group who memorializes World War II crash sites in France. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Notice that I didn't try to pronounce the name of the group in France. I'll let you do that. But
I'll embarrass myself. I will not.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Everything about airplanes now seems so maddeningly routine. The security, the waiting, the boarding, the luggage, the instructions, the taking off, the cruising altitude, the landing, to the point where people think much more about where the plane is taking them as opposed to the plane itself. But not so, though, in 1920. Flying was less than 2 decades old, and Hazel Ying Lee of Portland, Oregon, was 8 years old. 8 years old. Susan, you described a scene where this little girl is playing with her friends in the street corner, on the street corner, when she looks up and sees an airplane. What was it like for her and for everyone of that time to see an airplane in real life?
Well, try to imagine a time when you didn't see airplanes in the sky. Maybe you saw birds, and all of a sudden you're seeing a machine flying, which seems impossible. I mean, cars are still relatively new. Not everybody's driving around in a car. So this is basically like a car in the sky. And to children, it had a huge impact to look up and see something flying, and you could often see the pilot because, of course, these were open cockpits, these early biplanes, and the pilot might wave if they were low enough. Must have been incredibly exciting.
You say a car, but at least a child had been on a bicycle before or something like that. Like, who could imagine what things would actually look like from way up in the sky, if I may? What did that view do for people who actually had been in an airplane and were able to look out from it?
Well, a lot of people, including Hazel, were struck by the idea that they'd never been more than 2 stories above the ground. And, we weren't skyscrapers. So maybe someone had been in a second or a third story window and looked down and seen that kind of view. But to see the world below them like that, well, it also felt very empowering. But it must have been amazing.
Where was aviation at that time? How difficult was it at that point? How dangerous was it? And what types of people tended to be pilots?
World War I pilots who had come back became barnstormers because there was an excess of aircraft from World War I. And these pilots wanted to make money. And so they flew into towns and did all these stunts and kind of got people excited about flying. The planes were, not very well put together. Often they were World War I planes that had fought in battles. So, engines would quit when they were up in the sky. I mean, there were many, many lives lost because the planes were not in great condition.
I'll pass. The picture on the cover of all right, so let's talk about Hazel. The picture on the cover of the book. She's wearing a flight suit with her goggles. She's holding a cigarette. It's eye-catching. And I will say I'm disappointed in myself because, and also disappointed in society that I didn't expect to see an Asian American woman in that flight suit in a picture that's that old. We've been conditioned simply to see sort of the white guy pilot in World War II posing with a plane, or maybe the Vietnam era. You see an older picture and you say, okay, that's just what a pilot looks like. To see her on the cover of this book, posing with a cigarette, with her flight goggles, is an eye-opening moment, because you say, oh, wait a minute, there's much more to this story than we have been led to believe. So, what was she up against as an ambitious woman? Forgetting the pilot part of this, what was she up against as an ambitious woman living in Oregon during the early 20th century?
Well, at the time she was born in 1912, one woman, the year before, a woman got her pilot's license. She was the first woman. And there was quite a lot of controversy about that. Not only should women not fly planes, but they shouldn't even be in the sky in an airplane because they were too temperamental and they would go crazy. Berserk is the word they often use. And that was the idea at the time. So when Hazel was young until, let's see, she had her first time in a plane, she was 19 years old. There were maybe 200 women pilots at that time, and it was about to really take off. But it was difficult for her even to find an instructor that would teach her, let alone that she was Chinese American. And we'll probably talk about that later, why
Yeah.
she liked that being a Chinese American. But being a Chinese American who, couldn't even have a job outside of Chinatown in Portland, she had to be invisible. And so for a Chinese American woman to walk up to, a pilot instructor and say, I want to take lessons, this guy that accepted her was quite an incredible man, Al Greenwood.
Yeah, and we're going to get to some of the piloting aspects of this, but I do want to ask, what rules had America put in place regarding Chinese Americans in the early 20th century?
Well, the Chinese Exclusion Act, I'm not sure about the date, maybe 18, I don't
I think it was
know,
about 1887 or 88. Yeah.
when that was adopted. And for the first time, Chinese immigrants were not allowed into the country. They made exceptions for merchants, which is probably how Hazel's father got here. I lost the track of the question there for a minute. Oh, what? Well, Chinese people couldn't own property. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold public office. They had to carry identification around with them. They couldn't leave the country without permission, even if they were born in this country. Hazel was born in America. She was a Chinese American. And she still, because her parents immigrated from China, she still had to follow all of these rules. And she could be stopped at any time and asked to show her identification. And in Portland, she could not go to public places. She couldn't go into most restaurants. She was a tennis player, and she couldn't play at the Multnomah Athletic Club or the Irvington Tennis Club because Chinese just weren't allowed to do that. So there were all kinds of restrictions and discrimination placed on her. She was in technically a public school, but it was a public school set up for Chinese people. So that was how they got around the rule, the Constitution.
So, what was her early life like? Who was she born to, and what seeds did you find in her early life that pointed to an adventurous, against all odds existence for her?
Well, she was herself right from the beginning, just an incredible, bold, courageous, not afraid to do anything. And in one of the earliest scenes in the book, she's racing the boys in the street, and she wins, of course. But she gets home and her mother says, don't do that, and her mother even says, girls stay put. I mean, that was what it was like for women at that time. Girls don't go out there and race the boys. You'll never get anywhere doing that. What was it like for her? They were a poor family in Chinatown. There were at one time as many as 11 people living in a very tiny apartment. They didn't have a lot of money. Her father worked at a restaurant, but her father died when she was about 18, which may have opened up the door for her to learn to fly. Her sister believes that, but I believe Hazel would have flown some way anyway. I mean, she was just determined, and that's how she was as a child, and she knew her mind, and she knew what she wanted.
Was Portland kind of an incubator, a home base for Chinese Americans? Was there a significant community there?
Yes, it was the second largest Chinatown in the country after San Francisco. So at that time, it was a very large community of Chinese Americans, a very tight community. They stayed within their community, and society was set up so that they would do that. They worked and they went to school inside Chinatown.
In 1932, she was 20 years old, and you mentioned this a little bit. She was offered a chance to take a ride in an airplane. just at a time where she was wondering in her life if she'd ever have a chance to do something meaningful. I guess maybe all 20-year-olds think that way, but she certainly had a lot going against her given her demographic, the demographic she had from birth. She couldn't refuse that opportunity. How did it come about? Where she's sitting, she's standing there, literally touching an airplane, and the guy goes, "Oh, you want to lift?"
Well, she was at an air show, and air shows were so common back then, all the time at these little airports. Portland had little airports all over, probably most cities did, for mail. So there were many, and she was at a little airport, and she actually went with a friend who was taking lessons from this man. He was taking lessons from Hans, who was the guy who came up to her after he'd done a demonstration. And he walked up, and she, of course, was in awe and looking at the plane. She'd never seen one close up. And he just asked her if she wanted a ride. And that started it. She fell in love.
Describe, if you can, the scene in the book is extraordinary. Describe, if you can, the actual ride she took and where they went and what she was able to see from I don't know if it's even called the window. It might have just been open.
It, it was two seats. So she would have been in the front seat and the pilot would be in the back seat, open
Uh-huh.
cockpit, nothing, just a couple of wings above her.
Oh my
And
God.
she described it. The only sensation she could come up that was close to it was swimming. That weightless feeling of being held by water was similar to the weightless feeling of being in the air. I think the sensation of flying, of just, when you take off, I don't know if you've been in a biplane, but when you take off, oh,
No, I don't think so. And
it's
I
the
never
best
will be in one.
park ride ever. Oh,
It's
you should.
what?
It's the best amusement park ride ever.
Oh,
You should if you have the chance. It's incredible. And you're out in the wind and the noise. You're like flying. That really feels like flying.
I only fly commercials, Susan.
Well, I still encourage you to try it out because
You're going to have to be a lot more convincing than that. There, there was and I have no problem flying commercial. I trust our commercial airline system, but I'm not going to be getting into a biplane anytime soon. I appreciate the offer, though. I do. Um, there, there was a Chinese American flight school in Portland. What are the odds of that? Why did Portland have a connection to flying and the Chinese? And um, would her story have been possible if she'd been growing up in, let's say, Phoenix or Boise?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Maybe. There were a few Chinese flying schools around the country, San Francisco, Portland, I believe Los Angeles, Chicago, and maybe I'm missing one other city. So she could have traveled, and knowing Hazel probably would have.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a miraculous opportunity for her. And no women had been allowed to fly. I mean, these Asian American young, they were really boys. They were very young people taken out of Chinatown, supported financially by the Chinese Benevolent Society, so which was basically businessmen in Portland, paid for this training for them. And they were being trained to go to war, to fight dogfights. Hazel having that opportunity definitely meant everything. But that it was in Portland, I think she would have found a way, and many people did find a way to go to other cities to do that. So these young Chinese American boys from Chinatown who didn't have the means to learn how to fly were being taught to fly so that they could go to China and fight against the invading Japanese. China had a very new Air Force. Actually, they had Air Forces all over the country. It wasn't a unified Air Force yet, but they needed help because the Japanese were invading and their Air Force was new. Hazel was accepted to be a student in the Chinese flying school, and she was the first woman to be accepted. Actually, she dragged a friend along with her, Virginia, who also became accepted. So the two of them became the only two women of the 32. There were two groups, but total of 32 that were sent to China to join their Air Force.
Before we keep going on the details of Hazel's story, I want to ask about you a little bit. First of all, and I also want to ask how you put this book together. How are there so many vivid details of some of these scenes? There are so many things from the routes the pilots took, what people were wearing, actual conversations. I guess my question is there like an actual archive of Hazel Ying Lee papers, or did you have to surmise some of these things based on, educated guesses?
The Texas Women's University has an extensive collection of WASP archives. It's an incredible collection. They have letters, photographs, journals, all kinds of documentation, a lot about Hazel, but the letters. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters written by her friends, her roommates about her. And back then, people wrote. And Madge Rutherford, who's a character in the book, she wrote home almost every day. So I had a very clear picture of everything that was going on and what they were doing. There's also other resources. There are several books written about the WASPs, and all of them mention Hazel. There was a documentary done about Hazel, and it was on public broadcasting called Brief Flight. And there they interview Hazel's sister and her best friend Elsie, who's in the book. There were lots. Oh, that's the other thing that Texas Women's University has is oral interviews. So it's like I was able to sit and interview these women who knew her, and they loved her so much. They all wrote about her and talked about her, and she did too. She wrote letters, of course, as well.
How did you get so interested in World War II? You seem to have a real affinity for it. The name of the organization of which you're a member, and I'm going to try to.
Oh, good. You do it.
I'm going to try to pronounce it. The Association des Sauveteurs des Aviateurs Allies. I
Yes.
don't know.
Yeah.
Who are they, and how did you get so interested in World War II?
Well, my father talked about World War II all the time when I was growing up because he had been shot down and in France and helped to escape through assistance of the French underground. So I knew these people. They wrote letters to my dad. I just felt very enmeshed in it all. And my parents were of that era. So, I grew up with the music and the movies. And I really do. I love everything about that era. And I feel like I lived during that era.
How has there never been a book about her? Why was her story so ripe to be forgotten, even by those of us who love history?
I'm not sure. I don't think she's completely been forgotten. There are, a couple of documentaries. People have written articles. She's mentioned in books about WASPs, but I was surprised that she seems to be a bit of a background character when her story was so significant and interesting and unusual. And, that she wanted to fight for her country despite the discrimination her country was putting against her. I just think it's a fascinating story. So I think in some ways her time has come. There's more interest in her now.
How much did it help you to know Portland the way you do? This story takes place in Portland. You live in Portland. How much did that help to be able to go to the same locations and to feel the city and to know the city's history and have the institutional knowledge about a city? Let's say she'd grown up here where I live in Tampa. I mean, that would have made things a little bit different for you, I imagine.
Yes, I felt like I knew her. I say this in the last chapter, that we're a couple of Portland girls. Being able to walk in her footsteps and walk in front of her apartment where she lived when she was a child and see her grave and her brother's grave at the cemetery. It helped a lot. And just as a writer, I like to be where I'm writing about. I always try to go and visit and be in the physical place that I'm writing about. It just gives you a whole different feeling for it.
How much of an expert did you have to become on aviation history in order to piece this all together? I don't know if you've been obsessed with planes your whole life. We just went to a museum, my wife and I and daughter, we went to a museum that has examples of almost every type of airplane that's ever existed. And it really is so eye-opening to see how this machine, for the lack of a better term, has evolved over the years. How much did you have to learn the ins and outs of airplanes in order to tell this story fairly?
I had to learn a lot, and I had help, especially from a pilot friend of mine and a couple, actually several pilots. But I grew up, my dad was a bombardier on a B-17. So I'm sure that my love of aviation started with my love of the B-17s. I just think those are the most beautiful aircraft ever. And I had the opportunity to fly in one in the nose where my dad was. So that definitely instills a love of aircraft. I'm not an expert. I had help. I'm not an expert on aviation, but I'm interested, and so I enjoyed the research and I enjoyed going out and seeing all the planes.
Did you think it was essential to telling this story to learn the planes themselves?
Yes, yes, I do. Even what they sounded like. Yes, I think so. Planes were Hazel's life. So in order to get inside Hazel, I needed to experience that too. That
Yeah.
understanding and appreciation for aircraft. Like you said, we take it for granted.
Yeah, so for granted. Uh, the other thing about, I guess, this story to me is that airplanes now, even the smaller ones, have 100 years of history behind them. Someone once told me that every single switch or light you see or indicator you see on an airplane is because someone else crashed because they didn't have that. And and sitting there in even a small airplane with a small cockpit, you get an appreciation for how much science and engineering there is behind this. How much did you have to take yourself out of this world of contemporary flying and bring yourself back to a time where they were still making mistakes day
Mhm.
in and day out, and people were losing their lives in huge numbers?
Well, I think I like to live in the past. I enjoy that. I really do when I'm writing about a time period, I'm there. I go back and I'm in that time period all day when I'm writing. And I just felt that. I felt like I walked among the plains at Swan Island, but seeing the plains as they are now helped me. But I think I just felt like I went there. I was there.
Yeah, so cool. All right, so explain, let's go back to the story a little bit here. Explain, if you can, the conflict between China and Japan. This is in the 1930s, and this starts to play a role in her first foray into real aviation. After she learns how to fly, she winds up going back to China. Explain when and why.
Yes, it gives her an opportunity. The Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, and China didn't have, they had air forces spread all over the country. I think there were 4 or 5 different air forces. So Japan comes in and they have a pretty easy time of it. And China realizes very quickly they need pilots, they need airplanes, and they need pilots. So where are they going to get pilots? They've got all their pilots in the sky. They go to the United States and they go to the cities where there are Chinatowns and they ask those benevolent societies, which are kind of the leaders of the Chinatowns, the merchants and the doctors, dentists, they ask them to help them find a flying school or to set up a flying school to train young Asian Americans to come and fly and help them in China. So that's what Al Greenwood was doing on Swan Island, which was the Portland airport at the time. He was teaching young Asian Americans to to fly in combat.
How much emotional connection did she feel to China? I mean, obviously she has family members, who came from there. The situation with her, I guess, brother, half brother is
Mhm.
very, very important. Explain how China became a center of gravity for her throughout her life.
Well, first of all, she was raised with a respect and honor toward the country that her parents came from. Her parents loved America. They wanted to be Americans, but they were Chinese and they embraced what was Chinese. And they wanted their children to have that same respect for the country where they came from. Um, I think for Hazel, when her father died, there was another opportunity. It was another one of those opportunities in her life that, of course, it eventually led to her, probably her being able to fly. But when her father died, she realized she wanted to go back to China and meet her half brother and half sister. Her father had been married before. He had a couple of grown children, and they stayed in China. So she could go back and meet them and meet her other relatives. So there was, I think, the three things, the, feeling a devotion to the country because her parents were born there, wanting to fly, and wanting to see her family members that she would not meet any other way.
How does her time in China play out? Explain what she's tasked with doing there and how things ultimately, they certainly didn't conclude between China and Japan, but how things wound up, where she winds up going back to America.
Well, when she arrived in China, it was very disappointing for her because they were coming to join the Air Force, of course, and they immediately found out that the two girls, Virginia and Hazel, would maybe be accepted into the Air Force, but they definitely wouldn't be allowed to fly. And Hazel was distraught because she'd been trained to fly in combat, and people had raised a lot of money. So she felt like, they were being cheated out of her training. So she was eventually commissioned. All of them were commissioned as officers. She was a lieutenant in the Air Force, but she was given a desk job. She worked in a library as well. She jokingly said she flew a desk. She was very disappointed, and she kept trying. She kept trying to fly. She did end up for a while flying commercial airplanes, but eventually the Japanese were doing very, very well. And eventually she was in Canton when one of the largest bombings took place, and she and her family escaped and made it to Hong Kong, where she was a war refugee for almost a year before coming back to the United States and hoping she could fly for the military of this country.
And when she went back to the United States, she wound up living in New York. Explain what she did there and how eye-opening was that for her to live in a city that clearly had, people from every possible region in the world.
Well, she loved it. Her sister lived in New York, and for the first time in her life, she could have a lot of fun. And she was a fun person. She enjoyed gambling, smoking cigarettes, going to the theater, smoking cigars, actually. Um, she was not what you'd call a typical woman of that time, and she had a lot of fun and she made a lot of friends, and she was definitely doing, things in Chinatown in New York. She was working for a company that was providing goods to China. In fact, she found out about this job while she was still in China, and they were getting supplies to China. And so she was helping China while she was in New York, but she was constantly contacting the Air Force, asking if she could fly for the military. And especially once Pearl Harbor happened, she thought, now's my chance. They're going to need this. And still not. They continued to tell.
Explain, yeah, explain the WASPs. How does she get mixed up with them? And she winds up becoming the first Chinese American military pilot.
It was another incredible opportunity that she saw an advertisement in a magazine asking for women pilots. And Jackie Cochran had begun a training program of women pilots to ferry aircraft in this country, and that would free up the men who were doing it now to go over into combat. So it would provide more men to be in combat, in the theater of combat. So Hazel applied for that and ended up in training in Sweetwater, Texas, where the WASPs were trained. And that's how she became a pilot, working for the military, but not in the military.
And explain what she did in World War II.
She did a number of things as a ferrying pilot. Mostly she moved aircraft from the factory. It would come right out of the factory, never having been flown before. So she was a test pilot first, and then she would take it maybe to embarkment to Europe or across the country to a flying school. She also trained men to fly, and she became a fighter pilot. And there were only, I think, about 100 women WASPs that were chosen to become fighter pilots. So she was the first Asian American woman to fly a fighter plane, which were called pursuits then.
Did she um, ever take on an actual role in actual combat?
No, because she was always in this country at that
Yeah.
time.
Did she express annoyance at the built-in obstacles that she had to face? Did she ever sit down at night and slam her fist down and go, all I want to do is serve this country as a
Yes.
combat pilot, and they're not letting me?
I think probably every night she did that. She did not understand it. I mean, first in China, she couldn't understand it. And now this is almost 10 years later, and all of her training and her skills. I mean, she would have been a flying ace. She was trained to do dog fights. She knew exactly what to do, and she was good. She was one of the best. She was one of the best in the WASP program too. So that they couldn't be allowed to fight made no sense at all to them. If we want to risk our lives, why can't we? And that was the attitude of a lot of the WASPs.
Unfortunately, she winds up losing her life in an aviation accident. But I want to ask you about the close call that she had, where she quite literally falls out of an airplane and winds up saving herself. Explain the close call, and then, if you can, we can just explain the very difficult circumstances surrounding her death.
Well, the close call was she was with her instructor in a plane. So this was still in Texas when she was training to become a WASP. And she didn't fasten her seatbelt securely. She thought she did, but she didn't. So when she went into an inverted loop, she fell out of the airplane. And the pilot looked around and she was gone. So she had her parachute, no problem.
No,
It's Hazel.
yeah,
She
that's fine.
lands, she's dragged, her shoes are knocked off, she's all scratched up, but she's got her D-ring, so she's going to be in the Caterpillar Club of, people who have parachuted out of an airplane. And she starts to walk back. It's all good. And of course, they come with a Jeep and they find her, but
Oh my
she's,
God. And then unfortunately, there is a miscommunication that doesn't sound like it was her fault. There were a number of planes up in the air, and she winds up in a collision and loses her life that way. Um, Explain that.
well, on that particular day, which happened to be Thanksgiving Day, the weather had kept the pilots overnight in many cities along this route. So there were a lot of P-63s being delivered in Montana, which were actually on their way to Russia. But so a lot of planes were descending at the same time. So that was the first problem. There were too many planes. The tower was not well staffed because it was Thanksgiving. I mean, one guy had a radio that didn't work, and because it was Thanksgiving, he couldn't get it fixed at the last fuel stop. So it was this pilot whose radio didn't work that ended up coming in right on top of Hazel. He didn't see Hazel underneath him. She didn't see him above her. And the tower is kind of freaking out. There's so many planes coming in. They're flashing red, they're flashing green. They're telling people to pull up. Hazel said her instructions were garbled, that she didn't get the instruction to pull up. But if she had, she still would have pulled up into him. The eyewitnesses that saw the crash said it looked like he just landed right on top of her. And their planes exploded, and they ended up going a little bit further down the runway, and he was able to climb out, and Hazel was carried out. She was on fire, literally on fire, and she lived for a few more days.
And it does sound like she was conscious and able to communicate about what happened a little bit too, right?
Yes, she was conscious and in terrible pain from her burns.
Mm. Horrible ending. She was only, I think, 30, 19, she was 32, right? Yeah, 33, 32. Yeah. Did she ever fall in love?
She did. She fell in love in Portland on Swan Island when she was training to go to China with another pilot, Clifford Louie. He had come down from Seattle to learn to fly, and they didn't fall in love initially. She was 19 and he was 18 when they met, but they ended up in China together, seeing each other a lot. And eventually, through a lot of adventures, they did get married in New York City, but they were not married very long before her death.
What would she have done had she lived? Would she have gone into politics or would she have remained a pilot?
Oh, she would have flown. She would have definitely flown. But she eventually would have been accepted into the military, which was so frustrating for the WASPs that they weren't allowed to be military. It did happen eventually. And she probably would have risen up through the ranks. That's what her friends believed. They said it was such a shame she wasn't here. She would have been somebody important and flying.
Have you considered how different her life and career would have been had she learned to fly, but there had not been these wars and military opportunities for her to accept? What would the likely path have been for an ambitious pilot in terms of the civilian flying here in this country?
For a civilian woman pilot,
Yeah.
there wasn't really anything. I mean, there were a few that were teaching, but people didn't want to be taught to fly by a woman. The airlines would not hire women to fly because they said their passengers wouldn't fly if they knew that a woman was the pilot. So women were not trusted to fly. And she didn't know what she was going to do when the WASPs were disbanded. And she decided she would go to China and fly that dangerous route called the Hump, which very few people survived, and was bringing supplies over the Himalayas into China. She was going to do that, and I'm sure she would have done that. She probably would have been the first woman to do it.
What was it like for you to reflect at her gravesite? I'm sure you've been there. How important is that for an author to visit the final resting place?
Well, it's a very personal experience. Like whenever you visit the grave of someone you know, I I was sad. I was heartbroken that she hadn't had more time, and I felt like this is where it all ended for her. And I hoped that I could carry on her inspiration. I felt a sense of responsibility toward her, but I felt like I knew her when I stood there. I felt
Mm.
like we were.
What's the lesson that we can all take away from her life, not just personally, but for our own country and what we want this country to be and represent?
Well, I think persistence and courage and determination. Hazel never gave up, but she was persistently relentless. She just kept going after whatever she wanted. She never said, oh, well, they've said no. She just kept going. And I think for the country to question these long held beliefs. Why weren't those women allowed to fly in combat when they had that training and they wanted to? Um, who decides?
Hmm. How would you design a monument to her, and where would that monument be?
Oh, it would definitely be the cover of the book, the picture with her leaning against the plane. She's just so alive
She's
and
so cool.
she's so cool. And you can just see in her face that she's doing something she loves to do. And she's proud. She's
And so
proud of her.
would it be a statue, and where would the statue be?
It would be a statue and it would be, oh boy, where would it be?
Where,
Portland.
I guess, in other words, where would it make the most impact? Where would telling her story make the most impact on the most people in order to make this world more open to people who want to achieve their dreams?
Where would it make the most impact? Maybe one of the World War II museums, or the
Mm,
World Memorial in DC, or the museum that's in New Orleans.
mm.
She was a significant part of World War II, and people don't know.
That would be cool. Have you decided what you're going to do next? Have you decided if you're going to do another book? I don't know how difficult this process was for you, but is there something else in the hopper?
Yes, in I go again. I said for a brief time, I'm not going to write about World War II anymore. No more aviation, and I'm going to write about a World War II aviator who is actually in American Flygirl, and it's Arthur Chin, who had a fascinating story. And he is known as the first World War II flying ace. And he was shot down 3 times. I mean, he just did all these incredible things, burned almost beyond recognition. His wife threw her body on top of him when they were being strapped, and she died to save his life. He comes back to Portland and he becomes a postman. And he lives the end of his life in obscurity, and there's a post office named for him here. But he was just an incredible character.
Is there
No
enough is there enough material on him to do a whole book?
There is, and in fact, his daughter is still alive, and his son has quite a collection of archives that I'm very excited about. So yes, there's enough.
That's awesome. Susan Tate Ankeny, the author of American Flygirl, the true story of Hazel Ying Lee, who followed her dream against all the odds and became an American hero. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Evan.
Check out the book. Check out her website, susantateankeny.com. She's also on Facebook and Instagram. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.